Hello, I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society. Even hard-working people can be poor. On today's edition of the Urban Agenda, we will discuss paying working people a living wage. I will be joined by two advocates for creating a law in New York City that would require companies that do business with the city to pay workers more than minimum wage. Joining me now is Bertha Lewis, Executive Director of the New York chapter of the nonprofit Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now, ACORN, and Paul Sonn, Associate Counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University School of Law. Paul, let's talk. What in the world is living wage?
A living wage, the term living wage has been adopted to describe, to communicate how inadequate the current minimum wage is. It's $5.10 an hour, $5.15 an hour at the federal level and the state level, and it's just not enough for a family to get by on. In response, local lawmakers around the country have started to adopt what they call living wage laws that set higher wage levels, more like $8, $9, $10 an hour, something closer to what a family really needs to get by, especially in a city as expensive as New York.
Well, let's talk about that, Bertha. Why not minimum wage? Everyone hears we got a protection for low-wage people.
Well, I mean, that's not really protection, but let me just lay some context here, and I'm going to use some notes because I want to make sure that people really understand what we're talking about when we talk about poverty in New York State. Here's a statistic for you. Of the 10 northern industrial states, of which New York, the great Empire State, is one, New York has the highest proportion of workers earning below the poverty level. Now, poverty level, Paul, is $10,000. That's outrageous for a family. Another fact, we talk about the economy and we talk about it growing really fast. The fastest growing segment of our economy is poverty level new jobs. 42.8% of all new jobs in New York State are poverty level jobs. This is a little bit disconcerting because New York City actually has a history of ensuring that taxpayer dollars do not support poverty jobs. This is what a living wage is about, because living wages target certain areas and certain industries, and usually with people that are getting some sort of tax breaks or some money from the city. Now, back in 1961, our mayor then, Mayor Wagner, put down $1.50 an hour as a living wage for New York City contractors. The minimum wage at that time was $1 an hour federally. If we had kept track,
proportion,
we would be paying $11 an hour now. And the last thing is, in New York City, 1/5 of all of our folks that work live below the poverty line. It's outrageous. We can't survive like this. We can't be a healthy city. That's why we need a living wage.
Well, Paul, now that we've described why you might need a living wage, how would you implement it? Are would something like this come into New York? You just essentially ask each employer to come up to a certain level, or what would you do? Yeah. And how are you describing supporting this effort?
The approach is to enact a local ordinance at the city council level, and a bill to adopt a New York City living wage law has been drafted and will be introduced in the New York City Council very shortly. This New York, as Bertha says, will really be playing catch-up with its history. New York used to be a leader in adopting legislation to protect the working poor. We've allowed that legacy to erode, and we've been surpassed by cities like New Orleans and Miami and Chicago and Los Angeles that have adopted local living wage laws to help low-wage workers.
So New York wouldn't be the first if it took this on?
Far from it. We would be approximately the 70th locality in the country. I mean, New York invented the minimum wage back in 1915 or so. It's really a turn of events that now we're playing catch-up with, what traditionally have been very sort of low-wage, conservative Sun Belt cities.
Mm-hmm. And the legislation would apply to whom? Which workers would be covered under it if it passes?
Because cities don't have the power to adopt a general minimum wage for all employees, these living wage laws apply to businesses that voluntarily choose to accept either contracts or economic development subsidies from the city. That means certain businesses that contract with the city to provide vital services to city employees, such as home health care services for the aged and the disabled. Those employers would have to raise their wages to this the level being proposed is $8.10 an hour, which
$8.10 an hour.
That's correct.
And what does that work to if you got a full year's salary on $8.10 an hour?
It's approximately $16,000 a year. I mean, we've been criticized, in fact, that this is way too low, that this just is not enough for a family to get by on in New York. But we view it as an appropriate first step, given the current sort of budget climate. But it's
now, would this include health insurance as well? How would that work? I mean, obviously, health insurance eats up a lot of workers, meager salaries as it is.
Absolutely, David. The bill would require employers to pay $8.10 an hour plus provide health benefits. If they choose not to provide health benefits, they would have to pay an additional $1.50 an hour for a total of $9.60. The idea is the employee would then have a little bit of money to purchase insurance on the private market.
Well, Bertha, I assume not everyone is just leaping for joy with this idea. What are the criticisms of this kind of effort?
It's very curious because some of the criticisms have come mainly from the business community. And time after time and city after city, it's almost like a knee-jerk reaction to say that if we pay people a little bit more money, that actually goes back into the economy, that somehow or another this will stop civilization as we know it. And there's been many studies of 12 cities that have passed living wage ordinances that actually show that, in fact, it does stimulate the economy. So you'll have opposition from the business industry. Actually, this new living wage ordinance that we're proposing really expands on a 1995 prevailing wage law. So again, we're not coming out with something so radical and so very new. So you'll get opposition from folks who say anything that challenges business is bad. However, for many years, we've been giving a lot of businesses millions of dollars in subsidies, and they say they'll retain jobs or they threaten to leave the city, and they never do. There's no accountability there. And all we're really saying is, especially now, with rebuilding our city, with so many public dollars coming in, we need to pay people a decent wage. I think for a full day's work, earning $16,000 a year to feed a family of 4 is not unreasonable.
Now, one of the other criticisms, Paul, I heard is that basically this is going to harm young people, teenagers who want to go to work, and a minimum wage job is a great way into the workforce, and this will somehow foreclose that.
We believe that argument is really misplaced. I mean, the jobs that are covered by this bill, home health care worker jobs, janitor jobs, they're jobs that that people who don't have any other options in our economy are working in. And the idea that you're going to have suburban teenagers or people with college degrees swooping in to take these jobs when they start paying $8.10 an hour rather than $6.50 an hour is, we really think, is not at all plausible.
I think the other thing that people don't seem to understand, we've been helping many of the displaced workers and the families of people who died at the World Trade Center. And these were all working people, many of them very low wage, in clerical, in security guard, and other in back of restaurants. And the stories they tell of the kind of work days they put in is just extraordinary. I'd like to see most of the elites work this hard.
For $8.10 an hour. I mean, you look, this bill is covering home health care attendants, as well as child care, daycare, and folks that take care of people who are in cerebral palsy. So from our very youngest to the elderly, these are the most vulnerable of our society, and these are jobs that are very intense, and people would be shocked to know that folks are getting paid $6.50 an hour.
Bertha, who else, what other organizations have stepped up to support this?
Well, this is what's really wonderful about not only the New York City bill, but also living wage ordinances across the country, is labor unions. And you say, well, most of these folks already make far above a minimum wage or a living wage. But I think what it says is for working people, that working people supporting each other with a cloud of labor coming to say that people deserve decent wages actually sets a floor for everyone. Mm-hmm. So the Central Labor Council here in New York City is supporting it. We have over 60 unions, individual locals that are doing it. Also, we have now over 135 congregations, ministers, clergy, from Muslims to Catholics to Protestants, Episcopalians, Baptists, Pentecostals, because they see this as a moral issue. We also, even though they're not covered in the bill, we enjoy support of nonprofit service providers in New York City, because unfortunately, after 9/11, and we're not trying to tax the city, but what we want to do is to set a floor for that. So folks that are providing services throughout, community-based organizations, because in low-income neighborhoods, these are the folks that are affected. So it is a broad coalition. We do enjoy the support of at least 25 city council members, and in fact, this bill was introduced by the Speaker of the new City Council. And I think that that sends a message that this city is vibrant and that this new City Council is courageous.
Now, have we gotten any indication from the new mayor as to his position on this bill?
Well, not exactly. We do know that the mayor wants to help business. And we're saying, Mr. Bloomberg, study after study by esteemed economists shows that living wage ordinances actually do help municipalities and help businesses. And because he's enjoying an image of someone who is inclusive and who does listen, that with all of the money that's coming in and with setting New York City's economy back on the road, this is one of the things that'll stimulate the economy. So we're very hopeful about Mayor Bloomberg, and we think as a businessman, he'll see this as a good business proposition.
We'll be right back to continue the Urban Agenda.
In America, you are not required to offer food to the hungry or shelter to the homeless. There is no ordinance forcing you to visit the lonely or comfort the infirm. In fact, nowhere in the Constitution does it say you have to provide anything for anybody. Thank you for all you've given. Imagine what more could do.
Welcome back to the Urban Agenda. We're talking about efforts to pass a law in New York that would require a living wage be paid to some workers. Our guests are Bertha Lewis of ACORN and Paul Sonn from the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU. Paul, let's talk about the business community. Obviously, business, as Bertha has described, get a little antsy when you start talking about living wage. Is the entire business community going to be opposed to this kind of thing?
We're confident that they won't be. That we understand, business gets nervous when they hear about, laws regulating wages. But I think when they see the details of this proposal, they'll see it's really very focused and reasonable. The part of the bill that would affect business says that businesses that get very major grants of taxpayer funds from the City of New York to create jobs in the city, grants above $500,000, that they should in return pay their lowest wage workers at least $8.10 an hour. And we believe that this is sort of a very modest sort of accountability standard, that if you're going to get major grants of taxpayer monies, particularly at this time when we have a budget crisis and really could be using the money for other things, the least that's, the appropriate thing to do is rebuild decent jobs for people at every level of the economy.
But what about the argument that we're in the midst of a recession, hopefully one that will end by the end of this year? Should we start imposing new burdens on a city that's already reeling, obviously, from the World Trade Center attacks and recession? isn't this going to be too costly for us to step up to?
Our cost analysis shows that the impact on business will be really modest. This is just bumping up low-end workers from $6.50 up to $8.10 an hour. And we believe that if you're going to, at this time of tight budgets, if you're going to seek taxpayer funds, this is sort of the least that corporate citizens can do in exchange. And we believe that when they see how modest this is, that the business community will really, support this initiative.
There's been also arguments across the country. And by the way, there's an organization called United for a Fair Economy, and they have a group here in New York in which Sarah Stranahan is one of the major supporters, called Responsible Wealth. And across the country, there's been...
Can you have responsible wealth?
Yes, you can.
Okay. Mayor Bloomberg.
These are people who are investors. These are people who own businesses. All across the country, there's over 230 of them that have signed the living wage pledge saying, we will pay our employees at least $8 an hour. But one of the things that we think is a residual effect of a living wage is you begin to save the city money by paying people. When you pay people a higher wage, not only does it go into these low-income areas where you buy more food, you buy more goods, and you buy more services.
And you pay utility bills.
And you pay utility bills, but you also begin to cut back on the funding that the city has to provide to fill the gap from health care to food stamps and to other kinds of services that we, the public, pay. So there's a trade-off in which economists are saying municipalities begin to save money on providing services to the poor.
What we haven't talked about, Paul, in addition to everything else, is how does this fit with people coming off welfare? How does the living wage match against that effort?
It's an important strategy, together with other policy proposals, to ensure that there are minimally decent jobs available for people as they reach their 5-year welfare time limits and are forced to make their way in the low-wage labor market. And people, with public assistance being limited, it's incumbent on all of us to make sure that these low-wage jobs, pay enough for people to put food on the table, so they're not burdening the city at soup kitchens and relying on taxpayer services. And we believe this is nowhere near enough, but it's an important first step in sort of helping boost the living standards for these needy workers.
What's the universe of people in the city we're talking about who would actually be affected if this were fully? We're just talking about a very limited project.
That's right.
This bill would only affect a very narrow group of low-wage workers.
Unfortunately, it's only about 75,000 of the many, actually more than 1 million low-wage workers in New York City. But the bill has been crafted so as to raise wages for those categories of low-wage workers where it won't have a significant budget impact on the city. Realizing that we have a city budget deficit and there will be risk. There are currently, we're having to consider cuts of vital services. It didn't seem the time to go with a full, broad living wage law of the sort that other cities have adopted.
So this, for instance, would not, in the first analysis, affect not-for-profits?
No, that's right. Currently, there are two main parts of the bill. The part that requires that certain agencies that contract with the city have to pay the living wage, and then this part that requires that businesses that get these taxpayer-funded subsidies have to pay the living wage. The taxpayer-funded subsidy part doesn't cost the city anything. This is a requirement that the businesses pay, and it's in exchange for getting very large taxpayer-funded grants, so it seems like a reasonable quid pro quo. On the city contractor side, the bill only applies to a very few categories of city contractors. The biggest is the Medicaid-funded home health care program. And the reason that doesn't cost the city anything is 90%, or hardly anything, is 90% of the cost of that program is paid for by the federal and state governments. So, and that's a huge socially important program.
And describe what the worker would be doing who is in that category.
It's composed of approximately 50,000, almost overwhelmingly women. They're overwhelmingly immigrant and African-American women, providing just vital social services that allow people who are elderly, who are sick, who have HIV, to remain in their homes rather than having to be institutionalized in a nursing home.
There's almost an argument when certainly a person who's depending so heavily on, this is not someone removed from you. who's you know, cleaning a street or even a security guard. This is somebody who's going to be looking after you and keeping you alive.
And your children too.
And your children.
Childcare and daycare.
Absolutely. It's a crucial investment for the city, and it not only helps the workers, but it helps fight the, I mean, there's a real problem keeping workers in these jobs because the pay is so poor, and that results in poor quality care to the elderly and disabled clients that rely on these workers. So investing a little more in better pay is in everyone's interest.
Yeah, it was interesting. You know, I think everyone has the notion that people who are low-wage workers are moving up the economic ladder. I was struck when we were talking to many of the workers who were displaced from 9/11, that some of them had been working in a low-wage job for 20 or 30 years.
Absolutely.
They had pieced together between their spouse or other wage earner in the household a life, but it was tough.
Well,
and they worked extraordinarily hard.
Part of the reason that New York ACORN is involved, as you know, New York ACORN is a membership organization of low-income folks. Right. And you know, besides education and housing, jobs have always been a major issue with our membership. Food service workers, the janitors, folks who do clean the streets, security guards are covered by this. And again, those who provide daycare for our children, as well as a small number of folks that take care of cerebral palsy folks. But
they're not willing to pay people who take care of cerebral palsy.
Well, you know, people,
$8, $10 an hour.
there are folks that will tell you, and it's a fact, that we pay zookeepers more than we pay child care and daycare workers. So when you look at $16,000 an hour and the fact that you would take care of animals and pay people to do that more than you would have to take care of your children is appalling. New York City has always been a leader. We've got to stay a leader. We've suffered a great tragedy, but what would be more despicable is to use that tragedy as an excuse not to lift this city up and to pay the kinds of wages that we need to pay. We're behind the country. I think it makes economic sense. It is covering folks who are really working very hard. And again, he makes the point that a lot of these low-wage workers are women who are heading households. Yeah. And when we're talking about trying to improve the education of our children, we need parents that get a decent job in order to help their children to get a decent education.
As Bertha is saying, and these aren't, you know, these aren't teenagers, you know, flipping burgers for, you know, to buy CDs. These are, you know, the people we all know who work in cafeterias in New York, who clean the buildings, who work as home health care workers, or parents supporting families. I mean, it's a critical sort of basic subsistence issue here.
Just describe very briefly, we talked about it, the problem of health insurance for low-wage workers and how this bill is attempting to deal with that, and what the likelihood of many of these employers being able to provide health insurance.
Yeah, the bill takes a first step. It requires employers to either provide health insurance or pay the worker an extra $1.50 an hour. That would make for a total of $9.60 an hour. The idea there would be the worker would try to use that extra bit of money to buy insurance in the private market. Now, again, we've been criticized that this is nowhere near enough, that we're being too modest, that given what a health insurance plan costs, you know, it's, you know, we're not asking employers to do enough for their low-wage workers, and we realize this. This is just a first step, but sort of underinsurance and uninsurance is a critical problem facing the low-wage workforce, and if employers don't do their part, we, the taxpayers, end up picking up the tab through the Medicaid program and you know, other subsidies.
We really want people to support this. I think now that it's been introduced in the city council and there's a new city council, you know, we're saying this is economic, this is political, this is moral. So what I would like to see happen for anyone that's watching this show is please call your city council person, call the mayor, call the speaker of the city council and say it is about time that New York City had a living wage. Labor is supporting it, other Democrats, Republicans even, the Working Families Party.
Right.
It makes good sense. And New York City, with this new spirit of rebounding, I think that this is a wonderful way that other folks can get together and support each other and say to our new government, this is the first step. It's not a panacea, but let's put us on this road to real recovery.
Paul, a closing statement?
Well, I mean, Bertha's right. The concept of the living wage was coined by a New Yorker and a Republican,
Right.
Teddy Roosevelt,
Right.
back in 1910. And this is a chance for New York to reclaim its leadership role in doing what we can for low-wage workers. New York invented the minimum wage under Mayor LaGuardia during the Depression. We were a national leader in making sure that government and business does its part to help the poor get by. Mayor Wagner was a leader in the 60s, and it's now, Mayor Bloomberg and Speaker Miller have the opportunity to reclaim this noble tradition.
My thanks to Bertha Lewis and Paul Sonn for joining us today.
Thank you.
Many New Yorkers may find it hard to believe that there are hundreds of thousands of full-time employees working very hard who earn salaries that aren't enough to support a family. Hard-working people still in poverty. CSS believes that working people need to earn a living wage, and we support the current efforts to enact a new law that addresses this serious problem for working poor people. I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society. Thank you for watching the Urban Agenda.
To comment on the Urban Agenda or for more information on CSS, contact Community Service Society of New York, 105 East 22nd Street, New York, New York, 10010. Area code 212-254-8900.